The back room of Flint's saloon smelled like a grave. Cheap whiskey, old sweat, and the kind of fear that chokes you. Mai's wrists were on fire, the coarse rope biting into her skin, raw and red. Every twitch was a fresh wave of agony. Beside her, her little sister Shia was curled into a ball on the filthy floorboards, shaking so hard it looked like she might come apart. She was just a kid, really, too small for this much terror. Flint stood over them. He wasn't just a man, he was a mountain of pure cruelty. A slick, ugly smile played on his lips. In the corner, his man, Cole, leaned against a wall, flipping a knife that caught the lamplight. Cole's grin was a wider, hungrier version of his boss's, showing off teeth stained the color of rust. 2 men, 2 shadows. And for the sisters, the world had shrunk to this one, suffocating room. Their father ran a laundry, worked himself into an early grave, and left them with nothing but a debt to this monster. A debt Flint had no intention of collecting in cash. "No silver," Flint had growled, his voice a low rumble. "You'll pay me in flesh." Mai's heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs. Her mouth was dust. He'd already slapped her once for talking back, and the metallic taste of blood was still on her tongue. She risked a look at Shia. Her sister's eyes were wide, shimmering with tears, a silent scream trapped inside. She was only 18, a flower that hadn't even had a chance to bloom. Flint's hand, thick and greasy, shot out and grabbed Mai's arm, hauling her to her feet. His breath was a hot, sour wave of whiskey. He was enjoying this. He was savoring their fear like a 5-course meal. "You or her," he sneered, his eyes flicking down to the trembling girl on the floor. "Make your choice." A tiny, choked sound escaped Shia's lips. It was pure terror, and it shattered what little fight Mai had left. She couldn't let him touch Shia. She would die first. The shame was a physical weight, a stone in her chest making it impossible to breathe. She squeezed her eyes shut, saw her father's kind face, and begged his spirit to forgive her for what she was about to do. Her voice was a broken whisper. "Me, please, just let her go." The words felt like poison, a surrender that stripped her bare. She wasn't just giving up her body, she was giving up her soul to save the only person she had left. "No!" Shia screamed, straining against her ropes. "Mai, don't! Somebody, please help us!" Her cry was thin, desperate, but it sliced through the thin walls of the saloon and out into the night. A prayer sent to a god that had long since abandoned this town. And in the front room, a man named Arthur Hayes heard it. He hadn't come to town for trouble. He was just an old rancher, in for some tobacco and a quiet drink, a man trying to escape the ghosts that whispered to him in the solitude of his home. His temples were gray, his shoulders stooped with the kind of weariness that comes from decades of hard work and harder memories. But that cry, it wasn't just a cry. It was an echo. A chilling, perfect echo of a scream he'd spent 10 long years trying to forget. The scream his own daughter, Sarah, had made right before the world went silent. Arthur set his whiskey glass down on the bar. The small clink of glass on wood sounded like a gunshot in the suddenly quiet room. He rose, slow and deliberate, his worn boots heavy on the floor. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. Every drunken prospector in the place turned to watch. He pushed through the swinging doors into the back room, and the scene hit him like a physical blow. Mai, her dress torn, her eyes a storm of despair. Shia, bound and sobbing. Flint, a vulture ready to feast. And Cole, in the corner, with that hungry grin and that gleaming knife. The room tilted. For a gut-wrenching second, it wasn't 1888 anymore. It was 10 years ago, on a cold, moonless night. He could smell the gunpowder. He could see the terror in his daughter's eyes. He could feel the helplessness that had eaten him alive ever since. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. His fingers, calloused from reins and plow handles, twitched near the butt of the old Colt revolver at his hip. Flint finally noticed him. "This ain't your business, old man," he snarled. "Turn around and walk away." But Arthur didn't move. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were locked on Mai. He saw her silent plea, the impossible hope warring with total despair. He saw a sister ready to sacrifice everything. The air in the room crackled, thick and heavy, ready to explode. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He had sworn an oath on a small, lonely grave. Never again. Never draw. Never kill. But here it was. The same choice. The same hell. Would he walk away and let it happen all over again? Flint's hand tightened on Mai's arm, his arrogance returning. "You heard me, old man. Walk away." Still, Arthur didn't move. His jaw was set like iron. His hand drifted another inch closer to his gun. The rust that had settled on his soul for a decade began to flake away, revealing the cold, hard steel beneath. Flint let out a cruel laugh. "This one's already offered herself up. A real sweet little thing. Said she'd do anything for me." He leered at Shia. "Maybe I'll take the little one after, just to be fair about the debt." Shia cried out again, a raw, desperate sound. "Please, mister, don't let him." And that cry snapped something inside Arthur. It was thunder in his chest. In one smooth, impossibly fast motion, his revolver was in his hand, the blued steel catching the light. The sharp, metallic click as he cocked the hammer was louder than a cannon shot. It was the sound of a promise being broken to keep a far more important one. Cole froze, his knife forgotten. Flint's grin vanished. No one in that room doubted for a second that Arthur Hayes was about to use that gun. "Untie them!" Arthur's voice was low, steady, and colder than a tombstone. It wasn't a request. It was the law. Flint hesitated, his beady eyes darting from the unwavering barrel of the gun to Mai's face. He was a big man, used to getting his way. But he wasn't stupid. He'd heard the whispers about Arthur Hayes, the quiet rancher who was once something else entirely. Flint's bravado shattered. Cursing, he fumbled with the knots, freeing the sisters. Mai stumbled and pulled Shia into a desperate hug, both of them shaking, their tears carving clean paths through the grime on their faces. Arthur kept the gun steady. He knew men like Flint only understood one language. "Get out," he said, his voice even colder now. "Both of you." Humiliated, Flint spat on the floor and backed toward the door. "This ain't over," he hissed. "You'll pay for this, old man." The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a threat. The room fell silent. Mai turned to Arthur, her voice shaking. "Why? You don't even know us." Arthur holstered his gun, the simple action seeming to drain all his energy. He looked at the two sisters and saw the ghost of his own daughter. "Because someone should have helped mine," he muttered, "and nobody did." Shia clung to her sister. "Are we safe now?" Arthur's gaze hardened as he looked at the door. "Safe?" he said grimly. "Not even close. A man like Flint never lets go." He looked at the sisters, a new weight settling on his shoulders. He hadn't just saved them. He had just declared war, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Flint would be back. Not just with Cole. He'd be back with friends, and he'd be back with the law on his side. The walk from the saloon felt like a mile through enemy territory. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Arthur walked beside the two sisters, his hand never far from his gun, his eyes scanning the darkness. At the edge of town, his horse, Dust Devil, waited patiently. He helped Shia up, then Mai. "You didn't have to do this," Mai whispered as he swung into the saddle. "Now he'll come for you, too." Arthur just shook his head. "I've had worse men than Flint come for me. I'm still here." But a cold dread was twisting in his gut. This was different. It wasn't just his life on the line now. His ranch was like him, worn, tired, but built to last. Inside the small cabin, he gave them water, stale bread, and cheese. They ate like starved animals while he sat and watched, the image of his own daughter at that same table, a fresh stab of pain. When they were done, Mai broke the silence. "What will happen when he comes back?" Arthur leaned back, the old chair groaning. "Oh, he'll come. His pride demands it." He looked at her, his gaze sharp. "But when he does, he'll find out he's not the only one who's ready." Shia clutched her cup like a shield. "You'll fight them? You're just one man." A dry chuckle escaped Arthur's lips, a sound like stones grinding together. Sometimes one man is enough. The sisters exchanged a look, a tiny flicker of trust in their eyes. The wind howled outside, a lonely sound that matched the emptiness in Arthur's heart. Mai lowered her voice. "Why us, Mr. Hayes? Our father. He came from across the ocean. We're strangers here. Why risk everything?" Arthur stared into the lantern flame. The answer was a truth he hadn't spoken in 10 years. "Because for too long, I did nothing. I turned away, and the person I loved most paid the price." His voice dropped, thick with grief. "Not again." The silence that followed was heavy, full of things unsaid, but as the sisters finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, Mai noticed something odd. Tucked away on a small shelf was a faded photograph. It was of Arthur, younger and smiling, with a woman and a young girl who looked hauntingly familiar. Behind them was another man, a man whose face she knew all too well. It was her father. Morning broke with a sharp, unforgiving chill. Mai couldn't shake the image of the photograph. Her father, smiling beside the very man who had just saved them. What did it mean? She stepped onto the porch where Arthur was brushing Dust Devil. "Do you really think he'll come today?" she asked. Arthur didn't turn. "Being shamed like that? It's a debt he'll be eager to settle. Men like him always come back." Shia joined them, her voice trembling. "What if he brings the law?" Arthur finally stopped and faced them, his expression grim. "The law in this town belongs to Flint. Deputy Warren has been in his pocket for years. That makes him worse than an outlaw. He wears a badge to hide the rot." The sisters' hope faltered. They were in a fortress, but the fortress was about to be besieged. Mai's mind raced back to the photograph. She had to know. "Mr. Hayes, I saw a picture, on your shelf, with a man who looked like my father." Arthur froze. The brush fell from his hand. For a long moment he didn't speak, his face a mask of stone. When he finally turned, his eyes were full of a pain so deep it was bottomless. "Your father. His name was Lee. He was my friend. More than a friend. He was my partner." The world seemed to stop spinning. Partner? Her father had been a simple laundryman. "I don't understand," Mai whispered. Arthur's voice was low, ragged. "We served in the war together. Afterwards, we came out here. We bought this land together. This ranch. Half of it was his." The pieces started clicking into place, forming a picture far more terrible than she could have imagined. Flint hadn't just been some saloon owner their father owed money to. "The debt," Mai said, her voice barely audible. "There was no debt, was there?" Arthur shook his head slowly. "No. Flint wanted this land. He's been trying to buy it for years, but Lee would never sell. Lee knew what was under it." Before he could explain, a rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. It wasn't Flint. It was the town doctor, a man named Elias. He reined in his horse, his face pale. "Arthur, you'd better come quick. It's Flint. He's telling everyone you kidnapped those girls. He and Warren are rounding up a posse." So it was starting. Not with a quiet threat, but with a public lie. Flint wasn't just coming for revenge. He was turning the whole town against them. Arthur saddled his horse, his movements urgent. Stay inside, he told the sisters. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. He rode off, leaving them alone with a shocking new truth and the sound of a gathering storm. Inside the cabin, the silence was suffocating. Mai's mind was a whirlwind. Her father, a landowner, a war hero, partners with Arthur. It was all a lie. Her entire life had been built on a lie told by her own father. Why? Shia was crying softly. What are we going to do, Mai? Mai looked around the small cabin, her eyes landing on an old locked chest in the corner. A chest that had belonged to Arthur's wife. But on the lock, she saw a familiar carving. A small, intricate dragon. It was the same symbol her father had carved into the frame of their mother's portrait. Her heart pounded. She found a poker from the fireplace and worked at the lock. It sprang open. Inside, beneath folded linens, was a leather-bound journal. It was her father's handwriting. As she read the first page, the blood drained from her face. The debt wasn't for money. It was for a secret her father had died to protect, and one that Flint was willing to kill them for. Because beneath Arthur's quiet ranch wasn't just dirt and rock. It was a fortune in silver. And her father's journal was the map. Arthur rode into town and found a hornet's nest. Flint was on the steps of the saloon, whipping a crowd into a frenzy. Deputy Warren stood beside him, his badge gleaming, nodding along to every lie. This man, this Arthur Hayes, Flint roared. He's a danger. He's taken 2 innocent girls, holding them against their will to avoid a lawful debt. Some in the crowd murmured, their faces uncertain. Others, men who owed Flint favors or feared his wrath, shouted in agreement. Arthur dismounted, his face grim. That's a lie, Flint, and you know it. Warren stepped forward, his hand on his gun. Now, Arthur, we don't want any trouble. Just hand over the girls and we can all go home. Arthur's eyes scanned the crowd. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw resentment. He knew these people. He knew how many of them had been squeezed and threatened by Flint over the years. You all know what kind of man he is, Arthur called out, his voice ringing with authority. Ask yourselves, who's the real kidnapper here? Flint laughed. Listen to him. The old man's lost his mind. He's the one who drew a gun in my saloon. Just then, a shot rang out. Not from Arthur, not from Warren. It came from a second-story window. Cole was up there, a rifle in his hands, a plume of smoke rising from the barrel. The bullet slammed into the wooden post right next to Arthur's head, sending splinters flying. It was a warning shot, but it was also a miscalculation. The crowd gasped. Firing a rifle into a public street, with women and children nearby. That crossed a line. The uncertainty on their faces began to harden into anger. They might be afraid of Flint, but they weren't killers. Flint's trap had backfired. He had meant to paint Arthur as a violent madman, but in that one moment, Cole had shown everyone who the real threat was. The tide was beginning to turn, but Arthur knew it wasn't enough. A shifting mood wouldn't stop the bullets that were sure to follow. He was still one man against a gang with the law in its pocket. Back at the ranch, Mai was devouring her father's journal. It was all there. The story of how he and Arthur had discovered the silver vein after the war. Their dream of building a real life, a legacy. But it also told a darker story. A story of Flint's relentless pressure, his threats escalating over the years. Her father hadn't told them to protect them from the wealth, but from the danger that came with it. He wrote about a partner Flint had before, a man who had mysteriously disappeared after a disagreement. Her father was terrified he'd be next. The last entry was chilling. Flint knows, it read. I don't know how, but he knows. He gave me an ultimatum. The deed to my half of the land, or he'll tell the girls about the debt. A debt I was forced to take on to protect them from him. Mai's blood ran cold. The debt was real, but it wasn't to Flint. It was to someone else, someone Flint was using as leverage. The journal didn't say who. It only said, I've hidden the real deed. He can have the forged one I made. The real one is safe. The dragon protects it." Shia, who had been looking out the window, let out a sharp gasp. "My, they're coming back." Mai ran to the window. It was Arthur riding hard. But behind him, gaining fast, was the posse. Flint, Warren, Cole, and at least 10 other men. They weren't coming to talk. They were coming to finish this. Arthur burst through the cabin door. "They're coming! We have to hold them off." He grabbed his rifle, his movements calm and practiced. "The root cellar, like I told you." "No," Mai said, holding up the journal. "We're not hiding. This is our land, our fight." She quickly explained what she'd found. The silver, the lie, the hidden deed. Arthur's face hardened as he listened. "The dragon," he muttered, his eyes darting around the room. He walked to the stone fireplace. On the mantel was a small, intricately carved wooden dragon, a gift Lee had given his wife years ago. Arthur twisted its head. There was a soft click, and a loose stone in the hearth popped open. Inside was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. The real deed, signed by both him and Lee, clear as day. They had the proof. But proof wouldn't stop the bullets that were about to start flying. The posse fanned out, taking cover behind rocks and trees, surrounding the small cabin. Flint's voice boomed across the yard. "Hayes! Send out the girls! This is your last chance!" Arthur looked at Mai and Shia, who were now huddled behind the overturned table, their faces pale but resolute. He had promised to protect them, but he had led them into a siege. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. He had drawn a line in the sand, and now the entire world was coming to wash it away. The first bullet shattered the window, spraying glass across the floor. The siege had begun. Arthur returned fire, his old rifle barking a sharp, defiant answer. He was a good shot, a disciplined soldier, but he was only one man. For every shot he fired, 10 came back, chewing up the wooden walls of the cabin, turning their small refuge into a death trap. Mai and Shia reloaded his spare pistols, their hands shaking but their movements surprisingly steady. They were no longer just victims, they were fighters. Hour after hour, the gunfight raged. The sun beat down, turning the yard into a furnace. Inside, the air was thick with gunpowder and the metallic tang of fear. Arthur was rationing his ammunition, making every shot count. But he knew it was a losing battle. They couldn't stay in the cabin forever. Sooner or later, their water would run out, or Flint's men would get bold enough to rush the house. Then, something changed. Down in the town, Dr. Elias, racked with guilt for not speaking up sooner, made a decision. He wasn't a fighter, but he was a man of medicine. He had treated enough of Flint's accidents over the years to know the truth. He went to the blacksmith, a quiet giant of a man named Gunner, whose younger brother had been run out of town by Flint. He went to the baker's wife, whose husband had been forced to pay protection money for years. One by one, he reminded them of Flint's reign of terror. The memory of Cole's reckless shot in the street was still fresh. The townspeople, who had been paralyzed by fear for so long, began to stir. They weren't gunmen, but they were tired of living under a tyrant's thumb. Led by Gunner, a small group of them grabbed old hunting rifles, pitchforks, and whatever else they could find, and started marching toward the ranch. They weren't a posse. They were a rebellion. Back at the cabin, Arthur was taking stock of his dwindling supply of cartridges when he heard a new sound. It wasn't gunfire. It was shouting. He peered through a crack in the wall and his eyes widened. A small army of his neighbors was cresting the hill, marching right toward the line of fire. Flint and his men, caught completely by surprise, turned their attention to the new threat. It was the opening Arthur needed. "Stay here!" he yelled to the sisters and burst out the back door, circling around the barn. He moved with the silence and speed of a predator, a man who was all too comfortable in the chaos of battle. He picked off 2 of Flint's men from the flank before they even knew what hit them. The tide had turned. Flint's hired guns, realizing they were now caught between a determined rancher and an angry mob, started to lose their nerve. Flint, seeing his power collapsing around him, panicked. He spotted Mai, who had crept to the doorway to watch the battle. With a roar of fury, he charged the cabin, hoping to grab a hostage, but he hadn't counted on Shia. The younger sister, who had been trembling in a corner just hours before, saw him coming. With a scream of pure rage, she grabbed the hot coffee pot from the stove and hurled it, contents and all, directly into Flint's face. He staggered back, howling in pain, his face scalded and temporarily blinded. At that moment, Arthur rounded the corner of the house. He and Flint stood face to face, just a few feet apart. Flint clawed for his gun, his eyes streaming, but Arthur was faster. The butt of his rifle came down hard, and Flint crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Cole, seeing his boss fall, threw down his rifle and surrendered. Deputy Warren tried to make a run for it, but he was cut off by Gunner the blacksmith, who lifted him off the ground with one massive hand. The fight was over. As the dust settled, the townspeople gathered in the yard, looking at the captured men, then at Arthur and the two sisters. A new respect was in their eyes. They hadn't just watched a man fight for his land. They had seen a community find its courage. Mai walked over to Arthur, the precious deed clutched in her hand. She didn't have to say anything. He just nodded, a small, weary smile touching his lips. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, then at the two young women who had reawakened something in him he thought was long dead. He hadn't just saved them. In a way, they had all saved each other. But as they tied up the last of Flint's men, a new cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. A lone rider, coming fast. It was the circuit judge, making his monthly rounds, summoned by a telegraph from a neighboring town about the posse. He rode into the yard, his face a stern mask of judicial authority, and took in the scene of chaos. Deputy Warren, seeing his chance, began to shout, "Judge! Thank God! This man, Arthur Hayes, he attacked us. He's a killer!" The judge dismounted, his eyes cold and assessing. He looked at the bound men, the armed townspeople, and at Arthur, who stood calmly, his rifle held loosely at his side. "I'll hear all sides of this," the judge said, his voice carrying an absolute authority that silenced everyone. "But first," he said, looking directly at Arthur, his expression unreadable, "you have some explaining to do. A man matching your description is wanted for a bank robbery in Carson City 10 years ago, a robbery where a young girl was killed in the crossfire." The air went still. Every eye turned to Arthur. The ghost from his past hadn't just been a memory, it was a wanted poster. Mai's heart stopped. Sarah, the daughter he had failed to save. It wasn't a random act of violence, it was a robbery he had been part of. The hero who had saved them was a wanted criminal, and the law had finally come for him. The silence in the yard was absolute. The townspeople, who had just hailed Arthur as a hero, now stared at him with confusion and dawning horror. A bank robber, a killer. Warren started to grin, a broken, bloody smile. "See, Judge, I told you he was no good." Arthur didn't move. His face was a blank canvas, all the exhaustion, the relief, the victory of the last few hours wiped away, replaced by a deep, hollow emptiness. He looked at Mai, and for the first time she saw not a savior, but a haunted man finally being cornered by his own demons. "It's true," Arthur said, his voice flat. "I was there." He took a deep breath, the confession seeming to age him another 10 years right before their eyes. "It was my crew, but I didn't kill her. My own daughter. She was a hostage. One of my own men. He shot her when things went wrong. I've been running from that day ever since." The story was more horrible than anyone could have imagined. He hadn't just lost a daughter to violence. He had led the violence to her doorstep. The judge's face was grim. "The law doesn't care about the details, Hayes. You were part of the crew. That makes you as guilty as the man who pulled the trigger." He gestured to Gunner. "Untie the deputy. He'll take this man into custody." It was a nightmare. The true villain was about to be set free, and their hero was about to be taken away in chains, all because of a past he couldn't outrun. But Mai stepped forward, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "No." All eyes turned to her. She held up her father's journal and the deed. "This man, Arthur Hayes, saved our lives. And this man," she said, pointing a trembling finger at the still unconscious Flint, "is the real criminal. He murdered our father for this land. He terrorized this town for years, and Deputy Warren helped him do it." She opened the journal. "It's all in here, written in my father's own hand." She handed the journal to the judge. He began to read, his expression slowly changing from stern disapproval to focused intensity. He read about the silver, the threats, the forged deed. He read about Flint's missing partner, a detail that clearly struck a chord. The judge looked up from the journal, his gaze falling on Flint. "I remember that case. A prospector named Miller. Vanished without a trace. Flint was the last one to see him alive. The pieces were all there. The journal was the key that unlocked a decade of crime and corruption." The judge closed the book. He looked at Warren, whose face had gone pale. He looked at Flint's men, now looking at their boss with new eyes. Then he looked at Arthur. "What you did 10 years ago was wrong, Hayes, and you'll have to answer for it. But what you did today—" He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the townspeople, who were now nodding in agreement. "Today, you brought justice to a town that was starving for it." He made his decision. "Gunner, keep the deputy tied up, and Flint. When they wake up, they're all going to stand trial, not just for this, but for the disappearance of Jedediah Miller, and for the murder of Lee." He then turned back to Arthur. "As for you, the warrant for your arrest is 10 years old. The only other surviving witness to that robbery was killed in a shootout 5 years ago. Without a witness to testify, the case is cold." He looked Arthur square in the eye. "It seems to me, Mr. Hayes, that you died in the wilderness years ago. The man standing here today is a rancher, protecting his property and his neighbors. As far as I'm concerned, that's the end of it." It wasn't a pardon. It was something more. It was a second chance. A wave of relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over the yard. The nightmare was truly over. In the days that followed, the town began to heal. With Flint and Warren gone, a weight was lifted. The people started talking to each other again, rebuilding the community that fear had shattered. Mai and Shia, using the deed their father had died to protect, officially registered their half of the ranch. The silver, they decided, would be used not to make them rich, but to build a real school, to help the families Flint had ruined, to turn their small, dusty town into a real home. Arthur Hayes stayed. He worked the land alongside the sisters, the shared labor a silent form of healing. The ghosts of his past were still there, but they were quieter now. They were joined by a new spirit, the kind face of his old friend Lee, finally at peace. The love that might grow between him and Mai was a quiet, unspoken thing, a seed planted in the ashes of their shared ordeal, waiting for the right time to grow. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Mai finally asked the question that had been lingering in her heart. Was it worth it? All of it? Arthur looked out at the land, his land, their land. He looked at the two women who had become his family. "Courage," he said, his voice quiet but sure, "is about choosing to stand when everything inside you wants to run. It's about breaking one promise to keep a more important one." He finally found a small, genuine smile. "Yeah," he said, "it was worth it." Sometimes, a single act of courage can change everything. It can save a life, free a town, and even redeem a soul. It reminds us that even in the darkest of nights, a single light can be enough to show the way home. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because there are always more strange, dark, and mysterious stories to tell.